Welcome back everyone, I am Brandon Schaefer and this is the third video of the drawing workshop for learning how to draw from the very beginning, basically. So in this video, I'm going to talk about some very important things. We're going to talk about proportions, measuring techniques, and values and shading. A lot of advanced, kind of intermediate advanced techniques. I hope I can really break this down, make it simple for you. I don't want to overwhelm you, but these are things that are going to be very important to learn before the last video where we do a full drawing demo. These things are going to be very important to learn so that we have like a more accurate, more realistic type of drawing. Learning proportions is one of the most important things and one of the things that's so difficult that people struggle with, and hopefully I can help you break it down a little bit easier, more simple, and help you create more correct proportions in all of your drawings moving forward. You know, it's just a few simple things to do at the very beginning of your drawing that's really, I hope, will really change your outlook on drawing and just a different way to approach it. And we're going to talk about comparative measuring. It's going to be very important for kind of correcting proportions when things might go wrong in our drawing. We can kind of use some measuring techniques from our reference photo compared to our drawing and really tweak things. And last but not least, we're going to talk about values and shading. And the reason I really kept values and shading off until now is because we don't really want to shade anything until we're happy with our drawing and the accuracy is very close to what we want. Because if you start adding shading before all that, before you get the proportions correct, and then you realize later on in your drawing after you shaded a lot that the proportions are off, it's going to be very difficult to correct. So we want to correct things from the very beginning before we add in all the detail and all the fun stuff where it really comes to life. So we're going to talk about some shading techniques and how to bring your drawing to life. So let's get into it. So this is where all the fun begins in drawing, where people struggle a lot. A lot of beginners struggle with proportions, and I understand it. It's very challenging, but I don't want you to get hung up on getting like perfect proportions. Things don't have to be super accurate, especially if you're drawing like animals or something. You know, I like to draw a lot of animals, and what I found is even if you don't get the proportions like dead on, it's still going to look like the animal. As long as you get it somewhat close, you'll be fine. So I have this jar here again. I think it's a great example. You know, there's a lot of interesting things going on. So we'll use this for measuring proportions. So what is proportions? So let's talk about that real quickly here. Proportions is the height versus width ratio. So this would be like 1 to 1, right? So this would be like 1 to 1. Now the numbers aren't really important, right? It's not about the numbers, it's about the height to the width. And what it ends up creating is this diagonal. That's really what the proportion truly is, but that really doesn't really matter for our purposes. What we're concerned about is the height versus the width. So let's say we're trying to draw this jar. And we can see when we just look at it, and don't worry about the handle right here. Let's just focus on the main part of the jar as like a cup. If we look at this, we observe it. That's what we need to do first, observe our subject. We can notice right away, and I hope you'll notice as well, is that the height is greater than the width measurement. It's taller than it is wider. And by doing this, we can measure and confirm this. So we can take the width measurement, turn it, measure it against the height. Yep, it's definitely taller than it is wider. So how much taller? We can mark it here. So it looks like the height is 2 times the width. So what that means is if we draw the width, we can make up, so the width is the smaller, shorter measurement. We can create a width on our paper. Doesn't matter how big or small, we'll just create it, right? And then we can just, okay, where do we want the bottom of the jar to be? Maybe right here. So we now have 3 sides of our jar, correct? But the problem is we don't know where the top is. And this top line is going to create that proportion that I was telling you about. You know, if we make the top here, it's probably going to be too short, right? It's not really the same proportion as this jar. So we need to figure out, we know that from what we just did on our jar, we know that the height is 2 times. So this would be 2 and this would be 1. So we can take this measurement, the width, and do the same thing that we did on our jar. We can mark the middle there. So there's the middle line. That's the center line. So we just made a square basically. So we took our width, flipped it on its side for vertically, and we made a square. So now we just double that square. So we take this square, move it up again. There's the top of our jar. And we can create, kind of guesstimate a center line vertically as well. These lines are usually good guidelines to have. They'll help you really figure out the rest of the stuff on your reference, having a center line. So what are we missing on here? We're missing the handle. So let's try to figure out this handle. We can compare either the height or the width of the handle versus the jar. That's something we can do. So we'll take this width of the handle and we'll compare it to this jar, to the width of the jar. Looks like, well, it's about half. So the width of this handle is about half of the jar. So that's really great because we have half the jar right here. This is half, this center line. So we can take this measurement, move it out, and put one end on the edge of the jar, and there's our other line. We'll mark it. There is the width of the handle now. So now we just need to figure out where the top and the bottom of the handle is. That's going to be more challenging, but what we can kind of try to do, let's just figure out the whole height of the handle, right? So we'll take this height of the handle, let's compare it to the width of the jar. So I'll turn it. Look at that, it's the same width as the jar. We're getting lucky today. Normally it's not this, normally things are not this perfect, right? Normally it'll be like this where, it's a lot bigger than the jar, a little bit bigger, so you have to kind of guesstimate. But okay, let's see, we have the height here. Turn it, and it's about the same width as the jar. So that's great. So now all we have to do is take the width of the jar, and we just re-engineer it. We take the width of the jar, turn it, and now that's the height of our handle. But we don't know where the top and bottom begins. So we'll just mark this down, we'll just guesstimate. So this is the bottom and this is the top, but we don't know if that's correct. It might need to move up, it might need to move down. How do we figure this out? So we got to do more measuring. So we got to figure out where. One thing we can do is try to find that horizontal center line, see if it lines up with the middle of the handle. That would be very helpful. So we'll take the width, rotate it, make a square, and we're going to find that center line. Here's the center line of the jar. So center line is right here. So it looks like it's above the center line of the handle, just a little bit. Okay, so that's good. So we know we can find the center of the handle, maybe here. Okay, and the center line of the jar is a little bit above. So here's the center line of the handle from what I have before. That looks like it's about right. So we can just draw this in here, just guesstimate. It's not a big deal, right? Use our blocking in methods of only straight lines, get rid of some of these guidelines here. And that looks about right. So now we have this jar pretty closely. We can start filling in some of these other details. Cut off the corners and stuff. Hey, then you can start filling in more of the details, make it look like our object. Cut in here, and there's our jar. It's pretty much our jar. And you can get as detailed as you want. This is just a quick sketch. I mean, you could take an hour to draw this jar, get it, everything, you could measure the width of the handle, the height, all this stuff. You can really go crazy with proportions, but it's up to you. It's personal preference. How detailed do you want to be about it? And if we look at this handle, you can see that it's a little bit smaller at the top. It kind of comes in. So my handle is a little bit large. It could probably come in just a little bit like this. This is where you get the details and stuff, right? Shapes and things, something like that maybe. It's still a little off. But like I said, this is just a quick sketch. This is just getting the concept of measuring, proportions. So if we were to try to, so this is a 2x1 kind of object, right? So if we were to try to draw this jar in a different proportion, it's not going to be correct. So if we were going to try to draw this jar like 3x1, right? It's going to be something like, it's almost like a water bottle if you do a 3x1, right? So this measurement will be like 3. The height will be 3 of the width. So it means you're going to have like 3 squares stacked. So these are squares. These are squares of the width, based on the width, the short measurement. These are 3 to 1. So see, that gives you a different diagonal as well. So you see the difference here in the diagonals, and that's the proportion, right? So if we were to draw something very horizontal, you're going to get a completely different diagonal. Less steep. More steep here, less steep here. So that's really what the proportion is. It's this diagonal. So something you can do once you know the proportions like this and you have it kind of figured out, you can draw it as large or as tall as you want. What's going to change it is if starting out with that very first mark that you put down. So if I make the width very small like this and then I make the bottom here, since the whole object, my drawing, is based on the width, this is going to be a very small jar because the width is only two times the width, the height, right? So it's something like this. It's going to be a very small jar that we draw. Still in the same exact proportions as this one that we did, but it's much smaller scale. If I change the height here, if I made this height twice as big, it's going to make the horizontal measurement twice as long. You know, so it's something you got to pay attention to because you want to make sure it fits on your paper. So what do we do when we have an object that's not really perfect like this? So I can think of a time where I was drawing a portrait of my cat, and her head wasn't a perfect square. It was almost a perfect square, but it wasn't. So I started out by measuring the width, and I knew where the top of her ears were. I could just mark that on my paper. So now my goal was to figure out where's the bottom of her mouth. And what I realized is that the bottom of her mouth wasn't a square. So when I took the width that I created and turned it, and I made a square. So it's always good to just make a square like that based on your width or your height, whatever is shorter, whichever is smaller, just make a square. And now you can use the bottom of this square. So that's what I did. So I knew her ears were up here. I'll just do like a silly sketch, right? So this is where like her ears were. This is the side of her head. And I knew her mouth came down somewhere, the bottom of her chin was like somewhere down here. So I didn't really have like a perfect measurement, but I knew a square was right here. So I tried to figure out what is around this line, this square, and it was the bottom of her nose. So the bottom of her nose is right there. So I could accurately draw the bottom of her nose. So from there I can kind of like figure out like, okay, the bottom of her mouth is kind of right here, kind of just guesstimate it. And then from there I can draw a center line on my square and a center line vertically. And now I can try to figure out like, okay, I can look at the photo reference I had. I can make a center line on the photo reference based on the square that I made, based on the width. And I can figure out what's right around here, what's right around these lines. And that was like her eyebrows or something. So her eyes were down here. I could kind of like guesstimate this stuff based on these guidelines that I had. So sometimes just creating a square on your object, even though your object is not a perfect square, she was kind of a little bit larger, it still was very useful because I could use these guidelines. And notice like these lines I'm making are very dark. If you're doing a real drawing, they're going to be very, very light, very, very light guidelines. So just keep that in mind. Like let's say we're going to draw an apple. An apple is pretty simple. It's almost like a sphere. If we're going to start drawing that apple, we can start off with the bottom. Okay, where do we want the bottom to be? We want it to be right there. Okay, how big do we want the apple to be? Maybe like this big. So now the proportion, to finish the proportion, all we have to figure out is where's the top of the apple? Is the top of the apple right here? Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? That's all we have to figure out. And once we figure that out, then we can get the correct proportion. Okay, there's the top of the apple right there. Oh, no, maybe it comes down a little bit. You know, this is how you figure out proportions. So you can determine 3 sides already. It's just figuring out where that last side is. That's going to give you that diagonal you're looking for, that proportion. Sometimes you can just mark a square, and then you could do the same thing on your subject, on your reference, and figure out, is your subject taller than the square or shorter than the square? And in this case, the apple was a little bit taller than the square. So I can just make it a little bit taller than the square based on the width. Hope that makes sense. So values are something, I know shading and stuff, it's really intimidating when you're starting out. It can be very challenging, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm going to simplify this. So we're going to start out with a sphere, a circle. We're going to turn it into a sphere. I'm just going to do a quick sketch here. It's probably going to be terrible, but just a quick sketch. So don't hold it against me. Light source, we'll have a light source shining from this way. And we'll have a shadow down here. It's going to be a shadow casted. Something like that. So something very quick. To simplify, so we know we're going to have light, we're going to have shadow. So maybe the shadow is going to be, it's going to wrap around this ball. Something like this, right? Don't want to make it too dark. Just like a guideline for me. Something like that. So there's the shadow. I'm gonna try to aim for, something to always aim for is 2 values in the light and 2 values in the dark. And on top of that, you can have 1 light accent, something that's very, very light, and 1 dark accent, something that's very, very dark. But really we want to keep it limited, very limited type of values. You know, 2 in the light, 2 in the dark. So we're going to have, we're going to use this white pastel pencil, and then we're going to have the paper, the mid-tone of the paper be a light value. And then for the darks, we can use, you know, I don't like to, for me, personal preference, I don't really like to go super dark with my values. When I use graphite, you know, I like to use pen and ink a lot. So there's like our 2 dark values, you know, something like that. So that's our value range that we want to set up for this sphere. So I'm going to start off just by filling in a very light value for all the shadows. This is a good method for shading. Just fill in 1 overall tone, very kind of a lighter tone. You can always go darker. It's more difficult to darken, it's more difficult to lighten shading than it is to darken it. It's really easy to darken it, right? But it's more difficult to lighten it up. So start off light. You can always push the values a bit darker if you want to. So we have 1 overall value now for the shadows very quickly. I'm doing this very, very quickly. You know, take your time. You could do this for like 20 minutes. Really take your time. But this is just for demonstration purposes, just for the concept. So 1 overall value. So that's going to be the reflected light, which is this lighter value. So that's light being reflected back into the shadows. And then now I'm going to go with a little slightly darker pencil, a 2B. Like I said, I don't really like to get super dark normally. You can try it. You can do what you want. You know, if you want, you can create hash marks if you want, like this. You don't even have to do like filling it in, shading. You know, you can do cross hatching. There's all different kinds of ways to shade. There's no right or wrong way. It's just whatever you like to do. You know, art is all about personal preference. So I really encourage you to find out what you like to do. So I'm just filling this in a little bit darker in some areas. And this is going to be our shadow value. So we have reflected light and we have shadow. It's going to get darker down towards the bottom here. So we have a little bit of reflected light on the edge here and more dark shadow as it's turning on the form there. And right underneath here is going to be kind of a dark accent. It's going to be the darkest thing because there's no light getting under there. And we'll just kind of fade that out. Because maybe there's light bouncing down here onto the table, so this part of the shadow won't be super dark, only be dark underneath the ball. Something like that. You know, we don't have to make it too complicated. So now we have two values in the light, or now we have two values in the dark, but only one value in the light. So we need to make a second value for the light. And we can do that by just filling in some of this light area. And we want to make sure to leave some of that tone of the paper there for the transition. Something like that. We can have a light accent here. We can make it super bright on the highlight. Get it as light as we can. And just fade it out from there. And that's a very easy way. So now we have these four values. We have this value structure, right? We have this light accent, very, very light. We have this light tone. And then we have the tone of the paper. And you can keep pushing this as much as you want. Try to really push it, make it very subtle. You know, take your time on this. You could even make this darker if you want. You know, you can go like the 4B, a 6B. You can go as dark as you want. And you could really get in there, make this dark. Like I said, I don't normally like to do that. But you can give it a shot. You can go in here, make it darker, really push it. You can play around with it. You can do all kinds of stuff. You can smear and smudge if you want. I don't really like to do that. Personal preference for me, I don't really like to smear and smudge. We can lighten up this reflected light. Really push the reflected light here. Really make it like very bright. You know, like there's a strong light being reflected there. You know, you can play around with it, but still, that's still in the shadows, so you want to keep that in mind. You don't want it to be too light. You know, still keep it in the shadows. Always separate the light from the shadows. But that's pretty nice. We zoom this out. Pretty nice. Not perfect, but pretty good to explain the concept here. Hope you guys understand. So always try to simplify your values into something like this. Maybe two in the dark. You could even do one value in the light if you want to have 3 values. Keep it real simple. But you know, between 3 to 5 values is pretty good to keep it something simplified. Get like a strong light effect, realistic, simplified, realistic effect. So. Practice with this, practice with shading. You know, it's going to take time and practice. Don't get discouraged. Just keep playing around with it. Do your best. Play around with these blending stumps and stuff. See what that effect, see what that's how it's gonna affect your drawing. Usually it makes stuff a little bit darker to do like this. But just play around with it. See if you like it. See if you enjoy it. See if you like the soft kind of softness. I can create like more softness here. You know. See if this is something, the effect that you like. If it's not, then okay, then don't do it again. You know, you could just play around, practice. And you can sit here for hours and hours just playing around and practicing, figuring out what you like, what you don't like. So I just kind of softened everything. So that could be more pleasing to you. That could be something you really like. And then you could get really detailed if you want, you know. So it's up to you. It's up to you to figure out what you want to do, what you like to do. And in this next video, we're going to do a whole drawing demonstration. We'll do kind of a sketch, kind of a drawing sketch. And we're going to shade it and just do our best and have some fun, you know. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this one. And I'll see you on the next video. Take care of yourself. Peace.